Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just a couple of quick announcements. Um, First of all, if you want to leave a comment, please leave a comment, and we will try to get to it as soon as we can. It's a new background today. It's already dark outside. We can't do outside anymore for this time. But if you like the background, give us a thumbs up. If you don't like the background, put it in the comments. We'll try to accommodate. Another thing that I want to announce is that we are looking for sponsors for this class. If this is something that you enjoy, please send us a message or send us or put a comment that you would like to sponsor, and we will reach out, and we really appreciate all the support. Okay, let's jump into it. This week, we're actually going to study, instead of a Torah portion, we're going to study about a special day that's coming up next Monday, actually. This coming Monday is a day called the Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul. It's a very special day. It's the birthday of both the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, as well as the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement. They're born on the same day, about 38 years apart, whatever it was. And as well, it is also the day that the Baal Shem Tov began the Hasidic movement. He started openly preaching and teaching on this day in the year 18th century. Let's put it that way. I don't have the exact figure right now, top of my head. So we're going to talk about the Baal Shem Tov. We'll start off with the Baal Shem Tov and some of one of his famous comments that he made. So we'll give a little background to this story. So the Baal Shem Tov, as we mentioned, was born in 1698 on the 18th of Elul. He came at a very unique time in Jewish history. The Jewish people were in a state of despair almost. It's this post the Khmelnytsky pogroms in what is today Ukraine. I don't know, some sort of Poland, Polish noblemen in that area, whatever it was, and this rebellion ended in the slaughter of tens of thousands of Jews, depending on which historians you ask. Is probably one of the most devastating attacks in Jewish history as far as sheer numbers. It was devastating especially to the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish community. Also at that time had been following those pogroms in 1648, 1649 was Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was somebody who was a false messiah. He tried to get the Jewish people into a frenzy, saying that he was the Messiah, and therefore they had to listen to him. And unfortunately, he entrapped many Jewish people, and eventually it ended up with his conversion to Islam. And many people were devastated to find out that this person that they had followed for so many years was a fraud. And it really was very devastating to the Jewish people. So, as a whole. So, that's the scene the Baal Shem Tov shows up in. The Jewish people, because of these pogroms and other tragedies, the Jewish people are in a state of financial decline as well. The Jewish people don't have much in Eastern Europe. Because of these pogroms, many people were displaced. Families did not have, also in that time in Poland and Russia, in these areas, Jews were forbidden from owning land and other basic rights, and it was very difficult to make a living. Because of that, that affects the spiritual aspect of the Jewish people as well, where we have, because Jews have a hard time making a living, Jewish children are at very young ages are joining the workforce because there was nothing to eat. So they're joining the workforce, helping their parents, trying to make a meager living in the trades and those kind of things. And Jewish people, scholarship goes down, and only you have kind of a class difference amongst the Jewish people where you have people who are extremely wealthy, and they're able to send their children to become scholars, so they become very knowledgeable in Jewish practice. And then you have, on the other hand, people who are poor, unless you were extremely gifted, and even then it was very difficult to try to study. There was no formal yeshivas that were really able to take you in. It was kind of just find a local rabbi, a local scholar, or a famous scholar. Maybe you could travel, and so it was very difficult from the Jewish people, where you have this class difference between poor Jews and rich Jews and knowledgeable Jews, and really you have, on the other hand, the Jews who are not knowledgeable. Some of them are illiterate. It wasn't like, that was okay, so some Jews, they just went to day school. I mean, you have kids who never had an opportunity to study, or kids who had very little. Maybe they could read letters, maybe they didn't even know how to put Jewish words together. So the state of Jewish people and this is the state that the Baal Shem Tov shows up on. And he starts off, his Baal Shem Tov's career starts off, he himself was an orphan at the age of 5 years old. Both his mother and his father passed away, and he goes through life as an orphan, and eventually at the age of about at the age of, I had it written down here somewhere, his 16th birthday. On his 16th birthday, Elijah the prophet reveals himself to him, and he starts teaching him the secrets of the Torah. The Baal Shem Tov gets involved with a clandestine group of Jewish mystics, and they try to encourage Jewish people on a very individual basis, but it was really very difficult for them to come out into the open. Jewish mysticism at that point had been a kind of, teacher-student, wasn't something taught openly. And at the age of 16, the Baal Shem Tov starts to get involved with them, and again, studying with Elijah the prophet. And then eventually, at the age of 26, he starts to study with a very special teacher for 10 years. His name was Achia Hashiloni. He was if you look in Tanakh, he is the teacher of Elijah. And this spiritual teacher is his teacher for 10 years. Eventually, he becomes the leader of the mystics at this time. And at the age of 36, he reveals himself as the Baal Shem Tov to the world. And he starts to openly start the Hasidic movement of encouraging Jews and lifting them up. And eventually, his name becomes well known as a miracle worker. That's where the name Baal Shem comes from. A Baal Shem is somebody who makes amulets and those kind of things. And eventually, when he was 62 years old, he passes away on Shavuos. And he has an amazing, I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but he has an amazing, very spiritual passing. There was clearly something spiritual going on. It wasn't just he got sick and he died, but it was something was very, all his students came, and he tells them everything that's going to happen throughout their life. He kind of tells them the rest of their life story. And eventually he passes away. And before he passes away, though, he tells his students, this is the key to our class tonight, he tells his students that I could have ascended to heaven in a chariot of fire, like Elijah the prophet. However, the Torah says, Ve'el afar tashu, right? The person, we come from dust, and we're going to end up in dust. So he wanted to have that completion of this idea, this Torah idea that he has to go back to the earth, and therefore he chose to pass away like a regular person, so to speak. And so to understand this, let's take a step back. Let's go to the story of Elijah. What is the story of Elijah? So the Elijah, it says, and if you look in, I have it here somewhere. If you look into the, if you go into the book of Kings, Elijah is with his student Elisha. His student Elisha is his prime student. This is the one who's going to be his successor, and he tells Elisha basically 3 times to leave him, and he's going to go. And Elisha says, I'm never leaving you. You're my teacher. He says, as God lives and by the life of your soul, I will not leave you. And they go to Beis Kel. Then they go to same conversation, and he says, I will not leave you. They go to Jericho, and eventually, as they're continuing to Jericho, he says, leave here, I'm going to Jordan. And he says, I'm not going to leave you. And as they continue walking, a fiery chariot and fiery horses appear and separate them. Elijah ascends to the heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw, and he was crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and their riders, and he saw him no longer. And Elisha rents his garments, and he picks up Elijah's coat, and returns to the bank of the Jordan. So we see this amazing story in the book of Kings. This is chapter Kings 2, chapter 1 through 13, and eventually, not eventually, but really what happens here is that Elijah lived such a perfect life that his body didn't need the refinement of going back to the earth. The reason we go back to the earth is because, whether even if we do everything correctly, but the body becomes so engrossed in the physical, it needs to have a kind of a rectification, and part of the rectification is going back into the earth and rots away or whatever goes on over there, and that is part of the rectification of the body. But Elijah's body was so perfect that it was able to ascend to heaven. So the question is, if the Baal Shem Tov said that he wanted to have this idea of this experience of going back to the dust, then is that implying that Elijah's passing or ascension to heaven in his body, is that implying that that he was imperfect in some way? So, in order to understand this, we're gonna have to figure out what is the purpose of Elijah being his role as his post-mortal role. Elijah as Elijah the prophet, not a physical prophet anymore, but Elijah, the almost an angel. That's what he becomes essentially. So there are three sources we're going to go into of Elijah's roles as in his post-corporal state. So the first role that we're going to go into is brought down in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and it says as follows: that the Jewish people had always circumcised their sons until they were divided into two kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Ephraim, who was King Achav, and the kingdom of Judah. And King Achav, he banned circumcision. I believe in English it's Ahab, however you say it in English. And Elijah said, until circumcision is unbanned, that the rain will not fall, and dew will not come on the earth. So essentially proclaiming a famine. And it becomes a famine. And Jezebel, she is the queen, and she says they want to kill Elijah. They want to execute him for his it's not raining, it's famine. So God reveals himself to Elijah, and he says, what are you doing here? And Elijah says, I am zealous for God. And God says, this is a repeat story, because Elijah in his previous career, he was actually Pinchas. I don't know if we talked about it in this year's Parsha class, but in the Parsha of Pinchas was zealous for God, and he avenges God's honor by killing the leader of the tribe of Shimon, Zimri, who committed adultery in front of all the Jewish people with a non-Jewish woman, and Pinchas eventually, in his second stint, becomes Elijah the prophet. So God says to him, you were zealous against adultery, and here you're being zealous. So he said, from now on, every circumcision you are going to be there. And in fact, that's why the sages said that the chair, there's always a special chair at a bris. It's called the chair of Elijah. And there's a special prayer that we say when we put the baby on the chair of Elijah, and Elijah is invited to every single circumcision. And at the same time, because of this idea, because he had kind of questioned the Jewish people's loyalty to circumcision, that God says you're going to be invited to every single one, and that's why we also don't invite people to a circumcision. We always just say this is when it's going to be, because we don't want to insult Elijah. Imagine you said, you're invited, and you say, well, I'm not coming, I can't make it. But you can't make it, and Elijah's there. We don't want to insult Elijah. Things never work out when you insult Elijah, as Jezebel learned the hard way, so we try to just inform people of a bris. That's one mission of Elijah, that he attends every single bris, even simultaneously. Right, you have many circumcisions all over the world, and he's an angel now, so he could do that. Okay. The next thing is the Seder night. On the night of the Seder, there are two customs related to Elijah. Number one is very famous. We pour the cup of Elijah and we invite him to our Seder. And the same thing applies to, there's also a custom that is people do not lock their doors on the Seder night to allow that if Elijah will come and announce that Mashiach will arrive, he'll find the Jewish people waiting for him with open doors, literally. So there is a custom not to lock your doors the Seder night because of that. And again, the idea is that Elijah is one of his jobs is to herald the coming of Mashiach. He will announce that Mashiach has arrived, and therefore, at the time we're celebrating the first redemption, we show that we still have faith and hope in the final redemption. So we have this special cup of Elijah and this idea of opening the doors. Now, a third idea of Elijah's role is his role as that he would save sages and help the sages when they were in dire straits. And the story is brought in the Zohar. It's called the Idra Rabbah. The Zohar is split up into many sections. One of the sections is, there's two sections of Idra. Idra literally means a convention or some sort, or a gathering in a room. My Aramaic is a little rusty. And what happened was twice, there's the Idra Zutta and the Idra Rabbah. It's the small convention and the big convention. We'll use that word for lack of a better one. And what happens is, when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the author of the Zohar, when he invites all the sages, one of the people he expects to be there is Elijah the prophet, and he asks Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet shows up late to this Idra, to this special gathering where they're revealing the secrets of the Torah, which is eventually recorded in the Zohar. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has this conversation with Elijah, fascinating conversation, and he says, "Why weren't you there in the beginning of the Idra?" He says, "I want this conference, this convention, conference, whatever you want to call it. God said, He chose all the people who are going to be part of it, and I was going to be there, and I was also invited, but God gave me a special mission." He said, "This mission is that I am going to have to save Rabbi Hamnuna." Rabbi Hamnuna was imprisoned by the Roman government, and he, I think it was the Roman government, and he was in some sort of dungeon in a palace, and he knocked over the wall, and he's able to save them, and eventually he gives them food because they didn't have any food in their dungeon, and by knocking over this wall, he killed 45 of the ministers of the king's palace. And it's this whole long story, but because this took 3 days, Elijah says this took 3 days. These 3 days were the first 3 days of this conference, of this Idra, and he says, therefore I couldn't make it. And our sages tell us that that even though Elijah, like we said, could be at a million places at once, he could be at every single Seder in the world, he could be at every single circumcision in the world, but when it comes to helping out the sages, in their honor, he comes with his body. And with his body, a body can only be in one place at a time. So we see here that Elijah has we see all the different roles of Elijah. And this, an event, his ultimate role, his future role, is going to be the role of announcing the Mashiach. And for him to do this, he needs his physical body. He needs his physical body in order to help the sages, and he needs his physical body to announce the Mashiach. Because of the honor of the Mashiach and the honor of these sages, he needs his physical body to do that. So Elijah's role was that of Elijah's role was he needed his physical body to be with him, and that's why he had to ascend heaven with his physical body. Versus, let's go back to the Baal Shem Tov. What is the Baal Shem Tov's role? The Baal Shem Tov's role, like we mentioned, was he showed up to the Jewish people in a time they were in a faint. And when somebody's in a faint, what do? You whisper their name in their ear. And when you whisper their name in their ear, that awakens their soul, because their soul has a connection to their name, and they hear their name being whispered, and it could arouse a person out of a fainting spell. So that is why the Baal Shem Tov's name was Yisrael, which means the Jewish people. We're the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. So the Baal Shem Tov's name, Yisrael, was exactly that. His job was to find people who were, so to speak, lifeless in their Judaism, and to awaken them and re-inspire them. So the Baal Shem Tov's idea was to take the lowest people, people who were uneducated, who had no opportunity to study, who had financial difficulties, they had no abilities, no wherewithal to be Jewish, and to awaken them and inspire them. Just like somebody who is in a faint, who has no capabilities. So a person, we whisper their name in their ear, and boom, and they wakes them up, and they're able to do things and accomplish it all over and be a person again. So the Baal Shem Tov was to go to the lowest depths and to find that spark. And therefore the Baal Shem Tov had to pass away in a normal way, because he wanted to go down to those depths, to go to the dust of the earth, and in some way elevate that as well. And that is why so in other words, the Baal Shem Tov, when he said that I needed to go into the earth, it wasn't saying that there was something wrong with what Elijah did. He was saying that for his role, his mission, as the precursor to the Mashiach, to elevate the entire world, even the lowest of the low, he had to have this idea of going back to the dust of the earth. Versus Elijah the prophet, for his role, he needed his physical body to go up to heaven, so he could be the one who shows up at every bris, he could be the one who shows up at every Seder, and eventually be the one who's going to announce the Mashiach. I just wanted to make a side note about this conversation. Rabbi Moshe Feller, who is one of the senior rabbis here in Minnesota, a senior Chabad rabbi, in the 1960s, he had a column in I think it was the Jewish Press, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself would edit in English his column and make corrections. And one column that he wrote that this story about the Baal Shem Tov, and how God sent the Baal Shem Tov to this world to awaken the Jewish people. And he wrote that when a person faints, you shout in their ear and it awakens them. And the Rebbe crossed out shout and wrote the word whisper. And Rabbi Feller always likes to, he is obviously one of my mentors, as one of the senior Chabad rabbi in Minnesota. He always tells the story how the Rebbe said, you don't have to, that a person, he's already there, right? You don't have to shout. You're not invigorating somebody, giving them something they don't have. That's what the shouting implies. The whisper means that all you need to do, there's only a little bit of a difference between a whisper and nothing at all. All you got to do is a little bit, and it awakens a person, and their soul burns strong. So that's a small anecdote in connection to our class tonight. Thank you for everybody so much for joining, and have a good Shabbos, and we will see you, God willing, next week.